The Syrian refugee crisis, he thinks, is the biggest regret of his presidency, that they didn't intervene. It is a very tricky situation here. It's not like one or the other, and I don't have an answer, and I have really no opinion on this because it's disastrous either way.
The thing is, Democrats domestically are making this situation much more fraught and much more dangerous by fomenting this utterly deranged climate around Russia in Congress, even in some state houses, in the media. It's beyond absurd. So the incentive that Trump is working within now is to demonstrate his hostility toward Russia and his antagonism toward Russia should something like this arise.
He's been criticized for Russia for the past 2 months. I mean, the most tricky. Listen, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You can have a relationship with Russia, which he clearly has. No, like, you are blind if you don't see that. And you cannot use it as a defense as the Democratic Party is. I think the Democratic Party needs to start talking about other things, not just Russia, which is very convenient to their narrative right now, which basically removes all responsibility for any actions that they need to take. But that doesn't mean that we have to be blind to intelligence information.
Well, the Democrats are creating a dangerous situation is the point. They need to talk about other things, but the way in which they are talking about Russia is increasing the likelihood of some kind of cataclysmic military confrontation when you have US troops and Russian forces literally in the same city in Syria.
I actually, we have obviously total disagreement on the panel on the Russia issue. And I disagree with you so thoroughly that I don't think it's as much of an issue as you think it is. So here's what I mean by that. So follow my chain of logic here. I actually think he really is in bed with the Russians, so that if the Russians fired and even killed Americans, that he really wouldn't do much about it. So it sounds like an outrage. What Trump would have to do alpha male and he's going to show him. I don't think he would.
So in order to placate the Democrats, what Trump would have to do is take stronger military action in retaliation against Russia?
He's not placating Democrats
But in order to placate you and to placate Democrats, he would have to do it. That's why the situation is so dangerous.
It's based on the assumption that Donald Trump actually cares about the Democrats. Newsflash, the Republicans are doing whatever they want without the Democrats. They've been doing it forever because the Democrats have no power because they're only using the Russian argument. If they actually talked about issues, then maybe they would have more power.
The Democrats are aligning with certain segments of the Republican Party to pressure Trump on Russia, and that's where he has incentive to assert his belligerence toward Putin.
So let me just agree with Michael in part there. I think the Democrats do warmonger and are in bed with McCain and Graham to try to push us towards more hostility with Russia, and that's disgusting, and we all are against that, right? But I also want to be clear about my position, for example. So like, I think that Trump definitely has to deal with the Russians. Now, I could be wrong, and I don't have all the evidence on financial transactions. Super clear on that, okay? My belief is that yes, he has some arrangement with the Russians. Okay, now, that doesn't mean I want you to go kill Russians. Right. No. Don't start a war with the Russians. You don't have to prove anything to me, Donald, okay? So power down and get those guys out of the middle of that mess because they're gonna get hit.
Well, two things are true. Number one, his son, I think a few years ago said some of the largest deals we do are in Russia. So there's definitely financial dealings that he has tried to cover up. But other than that, the fear mongering and the hysteria has been on, Russia hacked our election and all this stuff that, Cenk and I might disagree with the severity of that. But what it comes down to is if something happens with Russia, it comes down to, Trump either is going to go with possible business dealings with Russia, or he's a giant narcissist, egomaniac who wants to look strong. And which one of those two things is going to win over? I think it's the narcissist, whip my thing out, and I'm going to be strong. But no matter what Rex Tillerson tells him.
The thing is, nobody has ever denied that Trump has had business dealings with various oligarchic Russians. I mean, he's bragged about that. His family has bragged about that. So that's not been covered up. What's happened is that Democrats and liberals have concocted this narrative where they make dealings with Russians to be somehow uniquely nefarious. And that's how they've tried to fuel this narrative of Trump, quote, being in bed or having an arrangement with Russians.
It's not just Trump.
But okay, so this is, we 100% disagree on this.
Well, what's the crux of the disagreement, though?
Michael,
I don't get it.
The reason is because it is uniquely nefarious, literally, because it helped swing an election. So thereby making it uniquely nefarious. And look, I don't think that they hacked us, so we certainly don't have evidence of that. And they did propaganda, and we do propaganda. So I'm not saying that it's like I've never heard of anything like this, and egads gadzooks, and I'm shocked and chagrined. I understand that but he has business dealings with Russia. Russia wants the sanctions lifted. Russia helps him during the election. So far, we all agree. And by the way, he will almost certainly lift the sanctions. So that's a uniquely nefarious deal. Do we have a deal with that like that with Tanzania? Do we have a deal like that with any other country?
China. I mean, he's also objectifying China. I'm so sorry.
And Saudi Arabia,
pushing
so
off.
three.
I mean, isn't it Russia's own intention to make China the enemy also? And that is another narrative that he has pushed out there. Something that President Obama, it was discussed today in the news, that President Obama worked very hard to make sure the Asian Pacific region was stable, and now China's thinking of pulling out of APEC.
But when you say help swing the election, I mean, what does that mean? It's not like Vladimir Putin was in Michigan behind people as they pulled down the lever. That doesn't mean anything. That's just Democrats deflecting from the fact that Hillary Clinton lost to a reality TV star Cheeto. I mean, I get what you're saying, propaganda, this and that, but there's no exit polls that show WikiLeaks played a big role. James Comey played a bigger role.
And the other thing is,
guys, just real quick, let me address that, okay? Because Jordan, everything swung the election. So I'm not trying to deflect anything from Hillary Clinton. She 1000% blew it. It is totally her responsibility. She was the candidate. The Democratic Party blew it. I'm not in that camp, right? But that does not mean that the Russians didn't also help to swing the election towards Trump. Now you could say so did Comey, so did the fact that she didn't visit a union hall in Michigan, and so did all these factors. And you're right about that. And what I'm saying is, the Russians doing fake news, doing the leaks, etc., was one of the factors. The leaks, I didn't mind at all because they were real news. The fake news I minded, that was literally not real. But okay, that's part. Hillary Clinton's was supposed to fight beyond that and actually win, and she's running against a complete clown. So I'm not excusing anything she did, but that doesn't mean that the Russians didn't want Trump to win, because they most clearly did.
I think they took advantage of a situation in which they knew that the Democratic Party was at its weakest state. They were looking at the numbers, saying this is a party that has lost 1,000 seats, raised all this money, doesn't have any investments statewide for organizing, and they're losing members under 40. So what do? They targeted those people under 40 consuming news online, and this has been reported on with this fake news to spread out that propaganda. Now, did it influence the election? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know if I agree with you with that, Cenk. I really don't. I think that they're at fault. But I think you're putting a foreign policy issue and a Democratic Party issue, and you're muddling them together, and they're not. It's not the same thing. The Democrats are using this as an excuse. It also is a true excuse that Donald Trump has been influenced by the Russians. Look at the cabinet picks. You've had people who
financially, absolutely.
I'm sorry.
Influenced by the Russians, though, what does that exactly mean?
When they pay for your speeches, a year before, when you're making $75,000 in speeches per speech in Russia, when you're sitting next to Vladimir Putin at a dinner where you're honoring Vladimir Putin and RT-TV, when you have a deal with RT-TV, a propaganda outlet. Literally, that is what is fueled by Russia. That person's a national security advisor, not to mention Rex Tillerson having the largest deal with Russia, oil deal in the history of history. So is that not evidence?
If Mike Flynn had given a paid speech in Israel and was compensated just as much as he was compensated for this Moscow speech, would you be just as incensed?
If there were 15 people on the cabinet and in the national security advisors' positions that also had deals like that, and Israel was trying to literally break apart the geopolitical situation. It's world power.
Breaking apart the geopolitical situation. See, this is where people who proclaim to be experts on the motives of, quote, the Russians. And imagine if people in Russia were saying, the Americans. What does the Americans mean? The American state is this huge multifarious entity with countervailing motives and competing interests. And it's the same thing with Russia. So this reductive interpretation of what their motives are, what Putin's are, by these amateur experts, is just beyond.
We don't kill our journalists, and they do.
Can somebody get me a
we just bomb them and drone them and kill them and imprison them. I mean, no big deal.
Journalists?
Yes.
So this could.
Let's all
on.
get a white Russian after this.
But this
Trump would like that.
But hold on,
it's like white and Russian. Okay.
But there's more to the story here. We have Graphic 8.
Okay, right? hold on. I just want to say, just real quick. Okay, look, and we got to wrap this up. But Michael, in the case of the U.S., yes, there's a lot of different forces at play, right? In the case of Russia, there's one guy in charge. I mean, there's not a lot of countervailing forces. I mean, are you saying that Putin is not completely in charge? That if there's countervailing forces, he either executed them or put them in prison.
I'm saying this attribution of motive to the Russians as if it's this single homogeneous entity that can be reduced in that way is silly.
Normally not the case, but under Putin, yeah, the case. Under Yeltsin, no, there was a lot of different things going on, right? But under Putin, yeah, he's got a clear motive and he's pushing that.
So then say Putin, don't say the Russians. I mean, what does the Russians mean? That's a propaganda derogatory term to make people irrationally fearful of Russians as somehow inherently sinister.
And
that's what I object to.
People of Russia. It's not the people.
Then don't say the Russians. Why are you saying the Russians
Putin,
then?
who runs the country, who is
Would you want to be called the Americans and have you conflated with the American government?
But again, no one's conflating Cenk with Donald Trump. No, I mean, or Lindsey Graham with Donald Trump. Putin literally dictates who is under his government.
Okay, but we really should just finish the story because this is really important. I mean, graphic 8. Okay, so, and speaking of the deranged hysteria, which I absolutely insist is the case in this, Mike Morel, who was an advisor to the Hillary Clinton campaign, former CIA director, came out, and this was reported by NBC News last night. He said, quote, on the question of the Trump campaign conspiring with the Russians here, there is smoke, but there is no fire at all. There's no little campfire, there's no little candle, there's no spark, and there's a lot of people looking for it. Now remember, for Mike Morel to make that admission is hugely significant because he in large part sparked this hysteria in the first place back in August when he wrote a column for the New York Times headlined, I ran the CIA, now I'm endorsing Hillary Clinton, and he asserted within that column, in the intelligence business, we would say that Mr. Putin had recruited Mr. Trump as an unwitting agent of the Russian Federation. A few months later, he said that Russia's potential collusion with Trump was, quote, the political equivalent of 9/11. So if now even Mike Morel, who was probably the most central figure in initiating this mind-boggling hysteria that is consuming the Democratic Party, if even now he admits that we should probably tamp down expectations of what will be uncovered here, I don't know, maybe it's time for a wake-up call.
Well, Michael Isikoff reported on this last year in April, and he's no friend of the Clintons. He's the one who broke the story.
Broke what story?
The Russia story.
Well, what specific story?
The initial the General Flynn.
Yeah, he broke the Flynn
He broke
story.
all of this.
And
he's not a Clinton friend.
Isikoff also had the Monica Lewinsky story, which the Clintons have not really
But I also think in terms of the media, James Clapper also came out and said there's no evidence of collusion. That was barely covered. Same thing with this.
No, I think Michael and Jordan's point on Morel and Clapper are totally fair. And so I think the jury's still out. I think I can give a lot of reasons why I think that is not indicative of the final answer and why he might say that. But I'm going to take the point and not even get into the minutia. Totally fair point. So I think that there is an issue, but I think that what I really want to do is get some sort of agreement here that nobody at this table, I don't think, is saying the Democratic Party is just fine. If it wasn't for those dastardly Russians, we would have won the election and everything would have been fine. And
some have said not us.
Not at this table.
Not our
right.
table.
So the thing that I think infuriates all four of us is when the Democratic Party says, no, it wasn't that we were too elitist. It wasn't that we didn't run a populist campaign. It wasn't that we weren't that we were the establishment. It was the damn Russians.
Right.
And so that no one here believes.
Well, I want to make one thing clear. When I'm saying, I think it's very likely there's financial dealings between Trump and Russia, and that could affect his decisions as president. That is 100%. What infuriates me is being around the country and seeing misery, corruption, and injustice everywhere. Yep. North Dakota, Flint, East Chicago, wherever I am. It's not rainbows and sunshine. And I get emails that night from the Democratic Party, which should be talking about these things, but are talking about Russia. Sure, if they want to talk about Russia here and there, or Trump's, a pinata, make Trump a pinata, that's politics. But they're not focusing on the bread table and economic issues, and that's why they lost.
Yep.
And by the way, there's a reason why they do that. So again, to end on agreement here. So the reason they do that is because if you talk about Flint and all the other places, then you got to start talking about the donors. But they have the same donors, so they don't. Tackling the actual problems is deeply problematic for them because they have conflicts of interest on most of those problems. If you're talking about the skyrocketing drug prices, well, a lot of the Democratic senators voted to block drugs from Canada, which would have saved us a lot of money.
Cory Booker.
So now, on the other hand, The defense contractors want hostilities with Russia, to Michael's point. Yep. So that's a win-win for them. Russia, bad guys, they're right there. And plus, that helps our donors.
Right.
So,
and here's another crucial point. And I've been covering these town hall meetings across the country, mostly California as of late, Democratic and Republican meetings. And you have these grassroots groups who have formed to counter the Trump agenda, Indivisible and other organizations sending activists to these meetings. And every meeting that I've gone to thus far, without exception, the single most discussed issue among these most activated members of the Democratic Party's base is Russia. Okay, so people constantly tell me on the internet, oh, you're focusing too much on this fixation. That means you're fixated. No, I'm reacting to a fixation that is plainly evident out there in the public. Initially, this hysteria was contained mostly to the elite classes, but at this point, it's now trickled down to the grassroots. So you have liberal activists running around with Trump plus Putin equals treason signs, Soviet insignia. I mean, the most outlandish stuff possible that we would associate with the deranged elements of the right are now being replicated in this bizarre way on the left. So that's concerning because it's putting the Democrats in an even worse predicament than they were prior to the election, because they're feeding into this hysterical narrative and they're letting it consume them and distract from what they could actually do to improve their tarnished image in the wider public.
You know what I think is funny? At the DNC debate, no one ever talked about Russia. They talked about losing races.
Oh, wow. Okay, hey, that's a nice positive note. Okay. A positive note for the Democrats on all the races they lose.
Internally.
Right.
We already hired one investigative reporting team thanks to you guys. Let's hire the second right now. Go to tytnetwork.com/go.